I'd like to welcome you to Harvard Bookstore for tonight's event with John DeMoss and Megan Marshall, who are joining us to discuss DeMoss's book, The Heathen School, A Story of Hope and Betrayal in the Age of the Early Republic.
I'm going to begin by saying just a few things about the book, which I have read and loved, and ask John to speak a bit about it, read a bit from it, and I'll have a few questions, and then we'll have questions from the audience. But I want to begin by thanking John for helping me to decide to write about Margaret Fuller. We met at the Radcliffe Institute, where we were both fellows, 2006 to 2007, and each fellow was required to give a presentation on their work. I was then working on a biography of Elizabeth Hawthorne, Nathaniel's older sister, a very obscure, reclusive person. And I gave my presentation, and everybody seemed to love it, and John said, well, I'd like to have coffee with you. And we went out for coffee, and I thought he'd say, oh, this was wonderful. And instead he said, you know, Megan, I think that's a good story, but you should do something big next after the Peabody sisters. And if you did, what would it be? And I was stunned. And what I thought of was, well, maybe I'd write about Margaret Fuller. So that's what I did. I'm going to go back to writing about Elizabeth Hawthorne. So don't worry, Radcliffe, I'll do it. So a kind of inverse thing happened. We, at the beginning of the year, with John, the case of John's book, we went around explaining what we were going to do, and rather bashfully, John said, well, I'm kind of interested in this school. It's obscure. It was in Connecticut, the Heathen School. I'm not really sure if there's a book in it, but that's what I was going to work on this year. And I just have to say that this book about something that seemed very obscure is a very big book, a very important book, and a very extremely well-written book. It has a kind of, in a certain way, dispassionate historian's voice to it, but as the events accumulate, it just becomes harrowing, and you can't put it down, and fearful almost. But he doesn't scare you too much. So what I'd like to have John do, if he's willing, is to explain how he went from this feeling that, maybe this wasn't big enough or maybe it wasn't important enough. How did he find that this would make a book? And if you talk a little bit about that and read a bit from it, then you'll know what we're all talking about.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks very much to the Harvard Bookstore for arranging this event. I really do want to do my own acknowledgement of my partner here who did this fantastic Margaret Fuller book. I'm glad if I had any tiny little piece of connection to that. I also would like to acknowledge a few people who are here in the audience who helped me a lot with this book. In particular, Jane Kamensky and Aaron Sachs. I'm not sure if Aaron's here. I sort of thought there he is. Okay, Aaron. Those two people read every last line of this book in manuscript and helped me more than I can easily say. I'm extremely grateful to them. And there are others here who read parts of it. I won't bother. And there are really several people here, I think, who helped me with the book. So, okay, a bit about how I came to the project, or I might almost say how the project came to me. It began completely by chance. This is quite a few years back, into the 1990s, in fact. I have an old friend who has a house in the town of Cornwall, Connecticut. He invited myself and my wife down there for dinner one summer evening. We were standing around in the yard, as I recall, before dinner. It was a beautiful evening. We had gin and tonics in our hands, and one of his neighbors, who was also a dinner guest, started to tell me what he called a piece of local history. I think I'd been introduced as a history guy, so he thought maybe this would be a good conversational gambit. And he started to tell me this piece of local history, and he wasn't very far into it before I thought, I really am interested in this. In fact, I'm extremely interested in this. It was only 3 or 4 minutes, but I really sensed from the outset that this was much more than just a piece of local history, that it had kind of national and even maybe international implications. I was so struck by it that when we went home that night, I couldn't sleep. I got up the next morning and drove straight to the Yale campus to go to the library to find out if anything else, anything previously had been known and written about this subject, and the answer was a little bit, but not really very much. So I embarked on what became a very long process. I mean, this is close to 20 years. Interrupted, I might say, along the way a couple of times for as much as several years. I went off to write other books, and I had some struggles with this project. Actually my biggest doubts were, to be completely candid here, were about my sources. I don't know whether should I give a 2-minute thumbnail about what this is?
Yes. Do the 2-minute thumbnail.
All right. So here's more or less what I heard that night in Cornwall. In the beginning of the 19th century, when the mood of the whole country and culture, in a sense, was one of kind of growing expansiveness, reaching out to the wide world, and included in that was perhaps the most powerful expression of that in some ways was the China trade. A trade ship in the China trade stopped in the Hawaiian Islands, as I think many ships did en route to the Far East. And while there, they sort of picked up not exactly a passenger, but a young Hawaiian man who became part of the ship's crew. His name was Henry Obukaya. Various complex events had sort of led him to the idea of leaving Hawaii, and he kind of stowed away, in effect, on this ship, became part of the crew, was on the ship for close to 2 years, I think, and then he wound up in New Haven, where he was sort of led off by the captain. And from there, he found his way to Yale, the steps of Yale College. And one morning, as the students were all passing in and out to class, I guess, he was sitting off to the side, quietly weeping. The students noticed this. In fact, I think they were this made a powerful kind of appeal to them. Who is this guy? Where did he come from? He clearly looked different. He was dark-skinned. He was wearing kind of ragged sailor clothes. So they went over to him and they asked him, what's the trouble? What's bothering you? And his answer, in sort of broken, halting English, was, because nobody gives me learning. He wanted something of what they were having at Yale College. Well, this made a strong appeal to them, and they took him under their wing. They took him into their rooms. They began to tutor him in English, and perhaps most important, from their point of view, try to convert him to Christianity. One thing led to another, and he was taken into the house of the then Yale president, Reverend Timothy Dwight, famous Protestant minister of the time. He became a kind of campus-wide project, and as time passed, and I'm skipping over a lot of stuff now here, he really became a kind of regional celebrity. He went all over New England, and he himself, after he converted, became a kind of preacher to various congregations. And he became, in effect, the germ, the seed of an idea for a missionary project. If they could do it for him, convert him, educate him, civilize him, quote unquote, maybe they could do it on a much wider scale. So that led to the founding of what was called officially the Foreign Mission School in Cornwall. Informally, it quickly became known as the Heathen School. Obukaya was the star student at the start. Other Hawaiians were there with him, and some from China and India, and a few Native Americans, and so on. And the school, it became quite famous for at least a short time, I think. People thought nothing like this has ever been tried before. And the goal was grand, not to say grandiose. The goal was nothing less than, to use their language, to save the world. Because there was an idea that if these students, or scholars as they called them, when they graduated, they would go back to their own homelands and sort of do the same thing, start schools and projects among their own people. And there was a kind of multiplier effect built into the whole idea. And if all went well, the whole world would be saved. maybe, and they actually tried to calculate the time. Some people thought 60 years. Some people, I think calculation was as little as 25 years. Anyway, it was, and I think it took me a while to really understand that they meant this very literally. And I should say too, that the idea of converting all the world's 600 million heathen, as they calculated the number, that was definitely thought of as being a kind of prelude to the coming of the millennium, to the kingdom of God on earth. The Bible said that the heathen should be converted before the millennium began. I think many people in the early 19th century really thought that the millennium might begin within their lifetimes if everything worked according to plan. Anyway, so here's the school. It's ongoing. It's kind of celebrated. People come from all over to look at it. The leaders, the sponsors, and the staff, especially the principal, report for a number of years that things are going just splendidly and according to plan. I realized after a while that I needn't really believe them. Actually, I think, in fact, there were serious difficulties and problems right from the start. One of the teachers complained that with students who come from so many different backgrounds, there must be as many classes as there are students. There were disciplinary problems. Students kind of kept running away and having to be retrieved. And quite a few had to be expelled along the way. In fact, it was an enormous task an impossible task that they had set themselves. But for a while, they maintained a good face for the school as a whole, and then something happened that was not part of the plan. I wonder if you can guess, maybe some of you. Romance developed between some of the heathen scholars and local women of Cornwall, which is to say white women. So this was crossing the race line and not acceptable probably to the great majority of Americans at the time, and certainly to many people in Cornwall. First, there was one case of this, a young Cherokee man named John Ridge. He fell in love with the daughter of the school's steward. The steward was the guy who was supposed to maintain kind of, everyday food for the students and other sort of practical needs. Ridge had been sick from an early age and had been taken into the steward's house for kind of close-up supervision and care. It was there that he met the steward's daughter. His name was Sarah Northrup, and they fell in love and so on. And then when it came out that they were about to marry, there was a tremendous public uproar. The school responded by trying to tamp public feeling down by saying that it was too bad, really unfortunate it had happened, but it would never happen again. It was very kind of a special circumstance. Soon it did happen again. Another young Cherokee romanced and married another young woman in Cornwall. Her name was Harriet Gold. Both couples went off to the Cherokee Nation. I'm really trying to fast forward here. And actually, both Ridge and Boudinot quickly became leaders of the Cherokees, and for a number of years were centrally involved in the whole controversy around Cherokee removal. This is where sort of you might say, the little story of the Heathen School intersects with the big story of national growth and development. Ridge and Boudinot are leading the resistance to removal. They're back and forth to Washington, negotiating with Andrew Jackson and other federal officials all the time. But then when it becomes clear that it's not going to, the Cherokees are going to be removed no matter what, the Supreme Court renders a decision in their favor, but Jackson and his administration say they're not going to enforce. So now, at that point, Ridge and Boudinot flip. And instead of trying to resist removal, they basically say to their fellow Cherokees, we got to just face the facts and accept what they called emigration and make under the best terms we can. And so they, in fact, became the chief promoters of what was known as the Treaty of New Echota, by which the Cherokees as a whole supposedly ceded all their land to the United States and went out to Oklahoma. For this, they were vilified by most of their fellow Cherokees. They were considered to be traitors. And soon after they arrived, all of them in Oklahoma, Ridge and Boudinot were both murdered, assassinated on the same morning in a kind of coordinated plot by their by their tribal opponents. To this day, many Cherokees feel very bitter about Ridge and Boudinot. That's a kind of quick thumbnail of the story. Now, why was I guess I was telling you the story just so you know the story. Should I?
Yeah, read a little bit. Read a little bit.
Okay.
And then I'll query you.
Okay.
Yeah. And there's a mic there you can grab.
I'm going to read you a little bit about the piece that's about the courtship. The piece that's about the courtship of Ridge and Boudinot. Ridge and,
Is the mic on? Are you hearing?
It doesn't sound like. Can you hear me without the mic?
Yeah, you're fine without the mic.
Do you need me to have the mic because of the?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
See if it's on. Okay, good.
How's this?
Yeah,
You can hear
good,
it now.
good.
Okay. All right. So, as I mentioned a minute ago, Ridge being ill with what they call scrofula. I'm still trying to figure out exactly. It was a kind of glandular condition. Does anybody here know what scrofula, how it would translate in medical terms today? I'm still trying to figure that out. Anyway, it made Ridge very weak and sometimes quite lame. And he had a bad attack, which actually went on for a couple of years when he was at the school in Cornwall. All right. Let's see. I'm going to sort of introduce one more character here before I start the reading. His father, a man called Major Ridge, Major because he had been an officer in the United States Army in the War of 1812. He was well known. He was very friendly with Andrew Jackson and other leaders of the federal government. So Major Ridge gets news of his son's illness in Cornwall. And I'll just kind of pick it up from there. Okay. When reports of John's worsening condition reached the Cherokee country, Major Ridge decided to undertake the long journey to Cornwall. His arrival there in mid-October was a local sensation. His dress, including, quote, a coat trimmed with gold lace and white top boots, his conveyance, quote, the most splendid carriage that ever entered the town, and commanding personal presence, quote, a tall and athletic form and noble bearing, made the deepest possible impression. He lodged in the town inn and stayed for a full 2 weeks. He called on Lyman Beecher, another famous Protestant minister much involved in the school, in nearby Litchfield, and conversed at length with the famous preacher, whose daughter Catherine, who would go on to become an important author in her own right, whose daughter Catherine described him as, quote, one of the princes of the forest. He was cordially received in various Cornwall households, including that of Dr. Gold. Dr. Gold had been treating John Ridge in his illness. Decades later, the doctor's son would write that, quote, no memory of my boyhood is clearer than that of a visit to my home in my 6th year of John Ridge and his father, Major Ridge, the Cherokee chief, in the uniform of a U.S. officer. The memory also included this, quote, my father exchanged presents with him, giving him a small telescope and receiving in turn from him an Indian pipe carved in black stone. The same pipe, nearly 3 feet in length, its surface burnished with the passage of time, hangs today enclosed in a glass casement on the living room wall in the home of a Gold descendant. Attached to it is an ancient label which reads, quote, this pipe once belonged to Major Ridge, a distinguished chief of the Cherokee Nation. It was presented to S.W. Gold in 1820 with the assurance of the giver that it had often been smoked in council. Perhaps you can imagine how thrilled I was to see that thing on the wall of this person today. It's a funny way in which I think some of those of us who are historians, you know, we read all these musty old documents and we wonder, did these things really happen that we're writing about? Well, seeing that pipe convinced me that the whole story was probably true, really did happen. It was generally expected that John Ridge would return home with his father, but when the time came, he remained in Cornwall. According to some accounts, he was still too feeble to risk travel, but several months later, Daggett, who was the principal of the school, declared, quote, he chose to stay and still does. Chose to stay and still does? Why? Was it really because of his illness? Or was something else holding him fast to Cornwall, to the school, to the steward's household, in which he would remain a patient for about 2 years? Enter Sarah. The story of their courtship was remembered decades later by a woman with a personal connection to all those involved. Her account, as dictated to her own daughter, remains the fullest we have. Though impossible to verify in every detail, it has the feel of authenticity. It centers on one particular occasion and begins thus, quote, Mrs. Northrop had so much work and care that she would send her daughter Sarah into John's room to take care of him. For a time, John's condition seemed to improve, so much so that, quote, Dr. Gold said to Mrs. Northrop, I do not think it best to give him any more medicine, but he has some deep trouble, and you must find out what it is. On an afternoon when Sarah had left the house, quote, Mrs. Northrop, taking her stockings to darn for the students, went in to sit with John. She said to him, John, you have some trouble, and you must tell me. You know, you have no mother here, only me, and you have always confided in me, as you would your own mother. He started up in wild amazement and said, I got trouble? No. She replied, I cannot leave until you tell me all. John, I do not want to tell you. Mrs. Northrop, you must tell me. John, well, if you must know, I love your Sarah. Mrs. Northrop, you must not. John, I know it, and that is the trouble. Mrs. Northrop, have you ever mentioned it to her? John, no. We have not said one word to each other. I dare not. But how could I help loving her when she has taken such good care of me these 2 years? When Sarah returned home that evening, her mother was waiting. Mrs. Northrop, Sarah, do you love John Ridge? Sarah, yes, I do love John. At that, quote, Mrs. Northrop saw there was trouble in the camp. The Northrops decided that swift action was essential to prevent further dalliance between the two young sweethearts. They must send their daughter away. Thus, shortly thereafter, quote, Mr. Northrop took Sarah to her grandparents in New Haven and told them why and what he had brought her for. He wished them to make parties and introduce her to other gentlemen and try every way to get her mind off John Ridge. Sarah would have none of it. She stayed 3 months, but, quote, would take no notice of any gentleman or any company. She had no appetite for food, lost flesh, and they thought she soon would be a victim of consumption. Understandably, her grandparents grew alarmed about her. There was nothing to do but send her home. There were difficulties, too, on John's side. Major Ridge and Susanna, that's John's mother, expected their son to take a wife from within the nation, preferably a chief's daughter. Thus, when John wrote home of his wish to marry Sarah, they were surprised and dismayed. Susanna consulted with one of the resident missionaries, who warned that a white woman might feel superior to, quote, the common Cherokees, and that her son would be more useful to his people, quote, were he connected with them in marriage. She then had a letter sent to John objecting strongly to his intentions. But when he replied by reaffirming his love for Sarah, his parents were persuaded to yield. It was clear now that their feelings could not be denied. Quote, John was dying for Sarah, and Sarah was dying for John. Sarah's parents weighed the possibilities and formed a new plan. Quote, Mrs. Northrop told John to go home and stay 2 years, and if he could come back without his crutches, he might marry Sarah. I guess that's all I'll read. What follows is all of the hullabaloo that is stirred up with some amazing stuff. I mean, there were threats to burn down the school and all kinds of, well, eventually there would be a kind of riot on the town green where people threatened to, destroy the school, and they burned some of the principal characters in effigy and so forth and so on. But I guess that's enough.
Excellent. So, one of the things that's fascinating about this book, which you can't, John hasn't described to you yet, is that it's written in a certain way in 3 voices or 3 perspectives. What he was reading there is kind of the major narrative, I guess you'd say. And my question will be, how did he think of this idea, and how does he think of them? So there's the voice that's telling the story, the historian's voice. Then occasionally there are these really fascinating maybe digressions where he tells something sort of blow by blow, not in that way, but kind of just goes down a vector that might have taken you away from the story, and they're set off in a different typeface. And then there are a few sections in which John himself goes to visit places where these events took place and describes what it's like. And what's fascinating about the way he's managed this is that all of these voices are in communication with each other. It's not a kind of, well, here's the historian, here's the digression, here's John Demos on location. They're all conversing with each other, which makes a very, a whole narrative. And I'm wondering how you came up with this ingenious plan and how you think of it. How would you describe
Well, I'm
it?
very glad to hear you say they come together, because one of my worries about the book was that the structure might be too complex to really make for a kind of smooth read. And as for the way it happened, I mean, it really just sort of evolved. I had the story to begin with. I mean, I did a lot after I heard the headline on the story that night in Cornwall. I did a lot of research. I kind of sorted out the main parts of the narrative. The next problem I confronted was the need to sort of contextualize the story. So actually the narrative chapters alternate with kind of short, I might call them stage-setting chapters, in which I talk about things like the China trade or the wider scope of the missionary impulse as it spread very widely through early 19th century America. I think there's always the need for a kind of balance between the stage setting and the story itself. It's hard to get it exactly right. I have moments when I think I might have had a different balance. Anyway, there was that aspect. And then perhaps the most unconventional part of this book, from at least the sort of history book standpoint, is what I call the interludes when I go to these various places. That was not part of the original plan. In fact, it didn't really emerge until fairly far along in the process. I got the idea that maybe I should go to Hawaii, because one of the chief characters, Henry Obukaya, the guy who showed up at Yale that day and all the rest that followed, came from Hawaii. Maybe I should try to see if I could find documents. And a research trip to Hawaii. All my previous research trips have been about as far as Worcester. So I went to Hawaii, and I had a terrific time. I wasn't on the beaches or the golf courses at all. I did find some valuable documents, but most of all, it was just engaging with Hawaii, this culture out of which Obukaya had come. I was actually able to go and stand on the little beach where the long-vanished village where he was born and grew up used to be. One thing led to another. And when I got home, I thought, I got to write about this some way. This is really part of the story. I really learned a lot more about Obukaya than I would have known otherwise, too. And having done that one kind of so-called interlude, I thought maybe I should do others, and so I went to North Georgia, the site of the original Cherokee Nation, and did something similar there. And the third of them is about Cornwall. That's a sort of obvious choice. So they kind of break the narrative at various points, but I hope not too much. You're encouraging me to think.
Yeah, no, they're absolutely wonderful, and there's so much heart in this book, and I think by putting yourself there, you allow that. I'm not saying it's sentimental or weepy, but you really feel for the characters. John's one of his previous books, The Unredeemed Captive, which I recommend highly as well if you haven't read it yet, but maybe you have. A lot of people have. It tells the story of Eunice Williams' captivity among the Mohawk, and she was taken from Deerfield in a sort of famous case, and didn't want to come back, I guess. And that involved a story that had been told many times, very famous in its time, and compared with the Heathen School, which seemed small and local and hadn't been written about endlessly. I'm wondering how much of a challenge it was to, or whether you had do you prefer to write about a big story that everybody, at least at one time, knew, or is this, you had to kind of make a story out of this one? Did you like that challenge?
Yeah, I guess that's true. I hadn't really thought about it that way. There was something both very attractive and challenging, but also daunting about making the story, as you put it. I guess, as I mentioned, I particularly sort of had difficulty with the sources. Mm-hmm. The biggest single batch of sources are the records and other documents created by the leaders of the school, the ministers and who ran it, basically. I had trouble with it. I don't know how quite to say it. I didn't really love them. I struggled all through. I didn't really believe in the project that they were doing. I thought it was a very mistaken, misguided idea from the beginning. I still kind of think so. I know they were, working within their own frame of reference, and in a sense they had the best of intentions. But I think it was a terrific case, a terrible case of overreach. And I reached points, at some points I felt so kind of alienated from them that that's when I dropped the project for various periods of time. And it wasn't just that I didn't really like what they were doing, it was also that they were difficult as sources because they were spinning the story all the time their own way. They sort of had to. They were constantly having to do PR that would lead to fundraising for the school and so on. They couldn't allow that there were problems. There are literally a couple of letters or documents in the official records of the school where the principal, he's reporting to the sponsoring American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions here in Boston, and he is going on for 3 pages about how wonderfully well everything is going. More and more of them are showing a great deal of interest in conversion, and they're making great progress in their studies and so on. And then there'll be a kind of PS at the end, and I had to expel 2 students for chronic drunkenness last week or something about that.
And this is 2 out of 12 or maybe 20, right?
Yeah.
So it's not.
So I didn't. Yeah. I found I had trouble sort of trusting them. I got over all this. I guess I did eventually. But
that sort of leads to my last question before we take questions from the audience. But I'll just say that among these documents, though, are these really poignant lists of donations that people were making to the school, and then the foodstuffs that they had on hand, and it's a very it's a tactile experience reading this.
I love the donations. They were my favorite source. The missionary journals would periodically, really every issue, I think for a while, print long lists of donations to the school. And they were mostly at the level of 2 shirts from so-and-so, or a bushel of potatoes, or you really got a feeling, tactile, of the sort of ground level interest in this project, which I think was really very wide and deep for a number of years.
Yeah. So my question was, both these books are in a way about failures. The failure to redeem this captive, and the failure of the Heathen School, which lasted only 10 years, I think. Do you think, failure is a story that we need to read more about in our American histories?
I do think, and I say it up front, I think in the preface to the prologue to the new book, that we like to tell the story of this country as a success story. Progress is its central note. But I think there have been important failures, almost necessarily, inevitably, along the way, and I think we need to acknowledge those. I think we can learn from those. The mission school was one kind of failure. The failure to redeem Eunice Williams was another kind. The Cherokee removal was another kind. So this is part of our history, and I guess I'm not apologizing for writing about failures. I think there's something to be learned there.
Yeah. Okay. So questions from out here. Yeah. So the question is about the sources. Were there adequate sources for all aspects of the story, or what did you do if there weren't?
I wish there had been more. And in particular, I wish I could have heard more directly from the scholars, the heathen youth who were brought to the school. So much of my information really came from the teachers and sponsors. There are some documents that come straight from them, and those are useful. Although, in a majority of cases, I think they feel obliged to spin the story the way that the leaders do. So it's only rarely that you get a kind of little shaft of light on their own perspective. I might say that it's clear and you don't have to read very far between the lines to see that many of them were very unhappy to be at the school. Even the principal would sometimes describe them as deeply depressed, or sometimes he used the word insane, almost insane. They ran away, as I mentioned. So, I mean, this was incredible. When you think about, suddenly coming from Hawaii and winding up in the middle of this very evangelical, Protestant, so on place in Cornwall, it must have been extremely unsettling, and I think in some cases disabling. I wish I'd had a little more of a direct line into that. It's there. There's enough there to see it, but there's a certain imbalance in the sources. Yeah. Thank you for the question. Well,
maybe you can summarize that question better than I can a little bit. Can you do it?
Well, the question is about some kind of connection or relevance in terms of present-day life and politics and issues that are all around us today, and I certainly felt some resonance at various points along the way. The biggest, sort of largest theme that I think is there in the Heathen School story, and there today, and there before the Heathen School, is, and I put this up front in the prologue, what we refer to as American exceptionalism. This, it seems to me, is a prime instance of a theme that has been very deep in our culture since the moment John Winthrop stepped off the boat in Boston in 1630 and announced that the Puritan settlers were building a city on a hill to kind of light the way to worldwide improvement. And I think it's gone on in various guises ever since. And I was very conscious of that from the beginning. In fact, I think that was probably the initial point of contact for me that night in Cornwall. The truth is that I had always wanted to find a historical project where I could really engage that theme. It's meaningful to me. My father was an immigrant from Greece. My mother grew up in very humble circumstances in the Pacific Northwest. They both went on to lead extremely rewarding and successful lives, and I'm sure they would have said only in America. And so I felt it's almost in my DNA. But on the other hand, it's a complicated matter, and it clearly has a downside as well as an upside. So I really was pleased to have a chance to take hold of that. In a way, it does, for me, the phrase American exceptionalism has suddenly reemerged in the last few years in public discourse. I'm not quite sure why, but anyway, that kind of thing meant a lot to me, for sure.
Great.
It's a little mixed. For one thing, Elias Boudinot's wife had died just before removal in childbirth, or right after childbirth. Although he then quickly remarried, so that second wife was there, and she was actually left in charge of the six children that Elias and Harriet had. And she came back to New England and brought the children back. She left some of them with their aunts and uncles in Connecticut. She took a couple up to Vermont, where she lived. And as for Sarah Northrop Ridge, she actually witnessed her husband's murder, as did their children. Happened right outside their house. It was a kind of ritual killing. And she was devastated, but she pulled herself together. She moved away from their home in Oklahoma and went to Fayetteville, Arkansas, where she became a kind of leading citizen, as far as I can tell, and died quite a few years later. And interestingly enough, the descendants of both couples are scattered across the country today. I've met a fair number of them. They're successful business and professional people, and many of them. They're very nice people, and some of them are kind of fully integrated into the mainstream society. Others retain a strong sense of their Cherokee identity. It was fun, actually, to kind of follow that up a little bit.
Yeah. So the question is there a connection between this heathen school and the later Indian schools?
Yeah. Well, I think there's some connection for sure. In fact, there had been Indian schools of one sort or another even before the heathen school, and there were some afterwards. But still, the heathen school, elevated it to a completely new level with the idea of bringing these people from all corners of the earth together with this very specific world-saving, and that's the word I use in here, and I think it's right, project. I don't think there was a kind of world-saving aspect to the Indian schools. I mean, they were sort of more local and specific, but there is a connection for sure. The one kind of important and lasting result of the failure of the Heathen School was, for the American missionary movement as a whole, was they basically decided it doesn't work to bring the heathen here to us. We got to go to where they live and do it on site with them to avoid these complications that we hadn't expected.
Yeah, the question is, what about the 100 years or so during which there were intermarriages of one sort or another between Indians and the colonists or the new Americans? And I think one of the great things about John's book is that he gives you kind of mini histories of all kinds of things like that. So I'm sure he's very well prepared to answer this question. But what was so fascinating to me was how the view of people in America changed about this around this time. There had been a sense on the part of many that intermarriage was a good solution.
Yeah, there were people even who advocated intermarriage in the 18th century as a way of bringing all the people of this continent together. But it was always men marrying, white men marrying, or it wasn't always marrying, it was sometimes just forming conjugal type relationships with Indian women, almost never the other way around. That, this gets into gender issues, gender politics, I think patriarchalism. So when this really seemed very different when it happened, and it was so open and out front. To the extent that intermarriage had occurred in the previous 2 centuries, much of it had been sort of on the frontier or among the Cherokees themselves. There were dozens, maybe even hundreds of intermarriages within the Cherokee Nation where white men had gone in and married Cherokee wives. In many ways, sort of for advantageous reasons of trade or whatever. But this was different.
Yes, yeah. How were the students gathered?
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
How they were recruited for the school? There were by this time there were missionaries scattered in different parts of the country, indeed around the world, and I think they were sort of on the lookout for here's a bright boy. Native boy who shows a lot of promise, and maybe at a certain point we can send him to Connecticut to the mission school. That's kind of the apex of the pyramid of this whole missionary idea. So they had kind of field representatives, you might almost say, in an informal sense. But I think that's really basically how it worked.
A pyramid scheme.
Pyramid scheme, yeah.
Well, thank you very much for coming. Thank you, John. And make sure that you buy his book and get him to sign it.